After my husband died, his children said, "We want everything, the house, the business, the entire inheritance." My lawyer begged me to fight. I said, "Give them everything." Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. The children were smiling, until their lawyer turned pale after reading. "And before we continue, please tell us which country you're from and how old you are. We really enjoy getting to know our audience. Enjoy listening." The flowers from the funeral were still standing in vases all over the house, heavy, cloying lilies and carnations whose sweet smell was already making my head spin. They had already arrived to grind me into dust, without even waiting for the memorial to end. I was sitting in Theodore's big leather armchair, in the inner sanctum of his home office, where he had spent thousands of evenings going through documents under the glow of the old green lamp and making plans for our shared future. I ran my hand over the worn armrest, still holding the warmth of his hands, and couldn't believe this was really happening. 22 years of marriage, a whole lifetime lived in perfect harmony. And now I had to sit there, curling in on myself, pretending that the two men standing in front of me had any moral right to decide my fate. Stephen, Theodore's older son, wore his father's death like an expensive, custom-made Italian suit. Mourning seemed to suit him, giving him a certain solemn importance. At 45, he had inherited his father's authority, broad shoulders, and imposing presence. But there wasn't a drop of warmth in him. Instead of a heart, it felt like a calculator was ticking inside his chest, and his steel-cold eyes slid over me without the slightest hint of sympathy, as if he weren't looking at his father's widow, but at a failing asset that needed to be written off. He spoke in that same condescending, velvety tone I had learned to hate over the years. "Daphne, we need to discuss some practical matters. Time doesn't wait." Edward, 3 years younger, but looking even older because of his early baldness and soft, puffy face, stood beside him like a loyal squire. If Stephen was all sharp angles, hard decisions, and icy logic, Edward was passive aggression wrapped thickly in sticky, fake concern. "We understand how hard this is for you," he added, his voice dripping with such sugary, artificial sympathy that I wanted to open a window to air out the room. "Losing Dad so suddenly. It's a terrible blow for all of us." For all of us. The words echoed in my head, throbbing dully in my temples. How could they even say that? As if it were they, and not me, who had held Theodore's dry hand through endless sleepless nights in the hospital, listening to his ragged breathing. As if it were they, and not me, who had to make the terrifying decisions about medications, caregivers, and pain relief when there was no hope left. Of course, they showed up at the funeral in full force, putting on a performance for the guests. Stephen flew in from San Francisco, dramatically leaving his prestigious law practice behind. Edward rushed in from Miami, where he supposedly ran some important consulting business. But for all 3 months while Theodore was fading away, while he called out for his sons in delirium, while he truly needed support, I was completely alone in that huge house. What practical matters could there be on a day like this? I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking, though inside a sticky, nauseating sense of dread was already spreading. The brothers exchanged a glance. In that brief, silent look was complete, absolute understanding, polished over decades. The conspirators' look that excluded all outsiders, including me. "It's about the inheritance, of course," Stephen said calmly, stepping up to the desk and running his finger across the polished surface. "Father's assets, real estate, business shares. We need to decide how everything will be distributed to avoid unnecessary bureaucracy." I felt my fingers dig into the soft leather of the chair until they turned white. The familiar texture, every scratch known to me, gave me a little strength. "Theodore and I discussed this many times," I said quietly but firmly, straightening my back. "He assured me everything was taken care of, that I would be protected." "Well, of course he wanted the best," Edward nodded. There was a nasty hint in his tone, as if I were a foolish woman missing something obvious. Dad did make arrangements, but maybe he didn't explain the full complexity of the legal situation to you. Stephen pulled a thick folder from his leather briefcase and casually tossed it onto the desk, the very desk where Theodore drank his coffee every morning and kissed me goodbye before leaving. The folder landed with a heavy thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. It looked official and intimidating, like any legal papers in the hands of a ruthless lawyer. The will is drafted very clearly, with no room for interpretation, Stephen continued, opening the folder with the theatrical precision of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. The house here in Boston, appraised at around $2.8 million, goes into joint ownership between Edward and me. The villa in Aspen, about $2.5 million, also goes to us. All business assets, roughly another $1.3 million, are likewise divided equally between us. Each number struck me like a slap across the face. Our home, the place where Theodore and I built our cozy world, chose wallpaper and curtains, hosted Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners, dreamed about holding our grandchildren and growing old together by the fireplace, was vanishing, crumbling to dust. The mountain house where we spent our second honeymoon celebrated our 10th anniversary, where he first said, looking at the snow-covered peaks, that he was truly happy only with me. All of it was slipping away to cold strangers. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice traitorously quiet, almost a whisper. Theodore couldn't have... Edward shifted awkwardly, avoiding my eyes, but Stephen's face remained unreadable, like a frozen mask. "Well, of course you were considered too. There's an insurance policy," he said dryly, flipping through the papers. $65,000. That should be more than enough for your future needs, considering your age and modest requirements. 65,000? For a 63-year-old woman who had given up a successful career 20 years ago for her husband's family? For someone who ran his household for 2 decades, entertained his demanding business partners, endured his difficult character, and nursed him like an infant during his illness? 65,000 to start life from scratch when youth was already long gone. "I don't understand," I whispered, feeling the ground give way beneath my feet as the room began to slowly spin. "This can't be right. Theodore promised me. He swore I would be provided for, that I would never have to worry about my next meal." "Nothing personal, Daphne," Edward cut in quickly, and the fake softness in his voice sent chills down my spine. Dad always wanted the family assets, what he built over the years, to stay within the bloodline. You're a smart woman, you understand. Blood is sacred. Bloodline. The words hung in the air like a sentence, as if the 22 years I spent as Theodore's faithful wife and their caring stepmother, washing socks, cooking meals, reconciling them with their father, meant absolutely nothing. As if love, loyalty, and a shared life weighed less on the scales of fate than simple genetics. "Of course, we're not heartless animals," Stephen added, snapping the folder shut with a loud clap. "You can stay in this house for 30 days while you look for something affordable and pack your things. We think that's more than fair." Fair? They thought 30 days to tear down, pack up, and remove my entire life was fair. I scanned the office, clinging to familiar details that would soon feel foreign, tainted by their presence. The bookshelf with first editions of Theodore's favorite novels, which we hunted down in second-hand shops. The window overlooking the garden, where I knew every rose bush. A small photograph in a silver frame on the desk, not theirs, but mine and Theodore's, from our wedding, where we're laughing at something, young and happy. "There's one more thing." Stephen's voice pulled me out of my bitter memories, and there was something ominous in his tone. He took out another document, smaller in size, but somehow far more dangerous than all the previous papers. During Father's illness, significant medical bills accumulated: intensive care, private clinics, specialized medications. Insurance covered most of it, but there's still a balance of about $60,000. Since you were his legal spouse and you were the one signing treatment consents and making decisions. The hospitals and doctors are legally expecting payment from you." The room swam before my eyes, the colors fading. 60,000 in debt against a 65,000 payout. That meant after paying everything, I'd be left with $5,000. 5,000, nothing. The price of a used car, not a new life. "But the inheritance?" I started, choking on outrage and hurt. "Aren't debts supposed to be covered by the deceased's assets?" "The assets are frozen until the inheritance process is completed. It's a long procedure," Edward cut in. "And given the specifics of the will and its wording, these debts are considered separate from the inherited property." "Very unfortunate, of course, but that's the law. There's nothing we can do." I looked at them. These two men who just 3 days earlier at the funeral had wiped their dry eyes with handkerchiefs and called me Mom, and I didn't recognize them. Stephen in his flawless suit, with the cold stare of a killer. Edward with his soft, bloated face and a voice full of poison. They had planned everything. They came to destroy me. "I need time to process this," I finally managed, feeling my throat seize up. "Of course," Stephen said easily, standing up and adjusting his perfectly fitted jacket. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, the 30-day countdown starts tomorrow morning. And the medical bills. The longer they go unpaid, the harder things will be later with collectors." They left, abandoning me alone in Theodore's office, surrounded by the ghosts of our happy life and the crushing, leaden weight of this new reality. The silence rang in my ears, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat. No comfort, no support, not even a hint that we could resolve this like human beings, like a family. I sat there, watching the evening sun slowly crawl across the wall, stretching the shadows, when my hands moved on their own toward a small hidden drawer in the desk, one that only I knew about. Theodore always kept little things there, meaningful only to him. Inside, beneath old yellowed receipts and a stack of business cards, my trembling fingers felt something cold and solid. I pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a small brass key, old, worn with time, darkened by someone's touch. I had never seen it before. It was too simple for a safe and too small for a door. It didn't fit any lock in the house. I knew that for sure. I knew every corner of this place. Why had Theodore hidden it here, so deep inside? I clenched the key in my palm until its sharp edges dug into my skin and looked out through the sheer curtains. Edward's car was still by the gate. The brothers stood next to it, heads bent together, talking animatedly, gesturing. Edward threw his head back and laughed. They were celebrating, already dividing the money, planning how they'd spend their wealth, which cars they'd buy, where they'd vacation. And not one of them even looked back at the house where their stepmother, their father's wife, sat on the ruins of her fate, crushed and betrayed. But as I watched them get into the car, slam the doors, and drive off in a cloud of dust, instead of the despair and tears I expected, another feeling began to stir inside me. At first, barely noticeable, like a spark, it grew stronger with every second, turning into a cold flame. They thought they had won, thought they had erased me from the family history, reduced me to an annoying statistical error. What they didn't know was that Theodore had always been smarter, more cunning, and more far-sighted than his self-absorbed sons ever realized. And over the years of our marriage, I had learned a few things from him too. The key in my hand seemed to warm, pulsing as if to say, the game isn't over. It's only just beginning. Michael Matthews had handled Theodore's affairs for 15 years, and in all that time, through endless meetings, contract signings, and business lunches, I had never seen him as unsettled as he was now. He sat across from me in his luxurious office in downtown Boston. His usual carefully polished calm had cracked, revealing an anxious elderly man behind the expensive facade of professionalism. "Daphne," he began, removing his thin gold-rimmed glasses and polishing them with a suede cloth for the third time in 10 minutes. I must warn you in the strongest possible terms, both as your lawyer and as a family friend. This is the wrong decision. You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." Bright morning sunlight flooded his spacious 15th floor office, cutting every object into sharp, contrasting shadows. Below, beyond the panoramic glass, the river shimmered lazily, and in the gleaming office towers opposite, like glass giants, thousands of people were right now making rational, balanced decisions, managing their fortunes and their lives. Looking at that anthill of success, I caught myself feeling desperately envious. They had solid ground beneath their feet. I had only quicksand. "I understand your concerns, Michael," I replied, and my voice sounded unexpectedly steady. "But I've already made my decision." He placed his glasses sharply on the desk and leaned forward, looking at me with sincere, almost fatherly urgency. "You can fight, Daphne. The will. There are oddities, inconsistencies. There are questions about Theodore's state of mind when it was drafted. We could challenge it, file a counterclaim, drag out the inheritance process for months, force Stephen and Edward to the negotiating table, and secure better terms for you." I spent a sleepless night sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, rereading the dry, heartless documents Stephen had left me. I kept searching for the answer to one single question. How could my Theodore, my closest person, so cruelly and coldly erase me from our shared life? The language of the documents was bureaucratic and merciless, reducing 22 years of love, care, and warmth to a couple of sterile paragraphs about proper provision and relevant arrangements. "And how long would this court battle take?" I asked quietly, looking the lawyer in the eyes. "Months, possibly years," he answered honestly, not looking away. "But Daphne, you have a real chance. I knew Theodore well, and this will... It doesn't match the man I knew. The man who spoke of you with such love and respect that it sometimes made my heart ache. Love and respect. Had I imagined those conversations by the fireplace when Theodore held my hand and promised he would take care of me? Had I, like a naive fool, misunderstood his assurance that I'd never have to worry about the future? And how am I supposed to live through those months or years of legal battles? I said with a bitter smile. Stephen made it very clear yesterday that the medical debts are my personal problem. $60,000, Michael. Right now. Even if I win the case 3 years from now, I'll be bankrupt and probably homeless long before that. Debt collectors won't wait for a judge's decision. Michael clenched his jaw so hard the muscles jumped in his cheekbones. Stephen and Edward are playing dirty, hard and ruthless. And that's exactly why you can't give them what they want. They're counting on your fear. They think you're too drained by grief to fight back. He was right. Every cell in my body, every nerve screamed that this was wrong, that Theodore could not have left me with nothing while his sons walked away with millions. But instincts couldn't pay the bills or put a roof over my head. What if I just give them everything they're asking for? I asked. Michael blinked as if he hadn't heard me correctly. Excuse me? What if I sign all the papers, give up any claims to the house, the villa, the business, and just walk away? How fast can that be done legally? Daphne, you can't be serious. You're talking about voluntarily giving up your legal rights to a multi-million-dollar estate. How fast, Michael? He stared at me for a long moment, studying my face. His professional mask finally slipped, replaced by genuine human concern and confusion. If you waive all claims and sign the proper disclaimers, a week, maybe 2. But why? Why would you even consider this? Surrendering without a fight? I looked at the river again, watching a small white pleasure boat struggling against the dark current. The captain seemed to know exactly where he was going, following some invisible map, confident in his course. Because the fight will destroy me, I finally said, feeling the words drop into the silence of the office like heavy stones. Even if I win, by the end of it I'll be a different person, bitter, exhausted, an old woman who spent her last years at war with her stepsons. Maybe it's better to accept the little they're offering, keep my sanity, and build something new from what's left. Michael leaned back in his leather chair, still scanning me with that sharp, penetrating gaze that had made him one of the most successful and expensive lawyers in Boston. Daphne, in 30 years of practice, I've never had a client, in their right mind, voluntarily walk away from a multi-million-dollar inheritance. Something doesn't add up. I'm missing something. Do you know something I don't? He was missing it, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't describe the strange, irrational certainty that had been growing in me since I found that mysterious key. All night I had wandered through the sleeping house like a ghost, searching for a lock it might fit, checking every drawer, every cabinet, every box. Nothing. And yet the key in my purse felt important. It seemed to pulse with warmth. It was as if Theodore was trying to speak to me from the other side, to send me a message I couldn't yet decipher. Maybe I'm just tired, I sighed, looking away. Tired of being the greedy stepmother trying to steal an inheritance from her husband's sons. Let them take what they believe is rightfully theirs. What they believe is rightfully theirs, the lawyer repeated, his voice growing firmer. Daphne, this isn't about what they deserve. It's about what Theodore wanted, and I'm telling you this as his friend and his lawyer. This will is false in its essence. It does not reflect his true will. Before I could respond, my phone on the desk buzzed briefly. A message from an unknown number. I glanced at the screen. Daphne, this is Edward. Could we meet today to discuss the timeline for vacating the house and transferring the property? We want everything to go as smoothly and quickly as possible for everyone involved. That politeness was almost worse than Stephen's icy, arrogant bluntness. At least Stephen didn't pretend to care. He was honest in his hostility, I thought. They're already planning the transfer, I said, showing the message to Michael. They don't doubt their victory for a second. His face darkened, his brows drawing together. They're rushing you. It's classic pressure tactics, Daphne, to not give the victim time to recover. I'm begging you, reconsider. Take time to grieve, to process your loss. Don't make irreversible decisions while you're in shock. But I wasn't in shock anymore. The numbing fog that had carried me through Theodore's illness and death was lifting, replaced by something like icy, crystal clarity. I couldn't fight Stephen and Edward head-on with their army of lawyers, their sense of entitlement, and their insider knowledge of their father's business. But maybe I didn't need a frontal attack. If I sign the papers, I said slowly, what exactly am I giving up? Michael let out a heavy sigh, conceding defeat, and took off his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. All rights to the main house in Boston, the estate in Aspen, all business assets, any joint accounts, and investment portfolios. You'll keep only the insurance payout and your personal property, clothes, jewelry, anything that belonged to you before the marriage. In return, they agree to cover the $60,000 in medical debt from the estate before distribution. You'll walk away clean, but practically penniless compared to what you could have had. That was something, at least. I'd keep the full $65,000, not a miserable $5,000 after paying the bills. Still nowhere near the comfortable old age I was used to, but enough to survive, rent an apartment, and figure out what came next. I need to see the exact wording, I said firmly. No loopholes for them. Michael opened his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard. I'll draft an agreement that protects your interests as much as humanly possible under these circumstances of suicidal generosity. But Daphne, once you sign this, there's no going back. You won't have any legal way to challenge the deal later, even if new information comes to light that could have changed your decision. Do you understand that? I understand. Even as I said it, I wasn't sure I truly did. The key in my purse felt heavier and heavier, as if filling with lead, a constant nagging reminder that Theodore had left me something, some message, some code I hadn't cracked yet. Was I making a terrible mistake by giving up so easily? Or was I being guided by an instinct deeper than logic, a woman's intuition that had never failed me before. My phone buzzed again, interrupting my thoughts. This time, it was Stephen. "Mom, we appreciate your reasonableness and cooperation during this difficult time. Edward and I want to make the transition painless. Perhaps we could finalize everything with the notary by the end of the week." Mom. He only ever called me that when he wanted something, and now the word sounded especially fake, like fingernails on foam. Where was that filial concern when I was sitting alone in echoing hospital corridors, waiting for the doctor's verdict? "They want everything signed by the end of the week," I told the lawyer, not hiding my contempt. "Of course they do," he replied. "The faster they get your signature, the less time you have to change your mind, uncover information, or consult anyone else." He stopped typing and looked at me intently. "Daphne, there's something wrong in all of this. Something rotten. Stephen and Edward are acting like they're afraid. Afraid you might find something that could complicate their inheritance? People don't usually rush inheritance matters unless they have something to hide." That thought had crossed my mind too, buzzing in my head like an annoying fly. In all the years I'd known Stephen and Edward, they'd never been particularly quick about anything. Stephen was obsessively thorough, checking every comma, and Edward was downright lazy when it came to business. This sudden hunger for speed, this race, was completely out of character for them. "Maybe they just want to turn the page as fast as possible and forget about me," I said, though I didn't really believe it myself. "Or they know something you don't." Michael snapped his laptop shut. "Daphne, I'm asking you one last time, as a friend. Will you take at least 48 hours to think this through? Sleep on it. Talk to a friend, a therapist, someone who isn't emotionally involved in this nightmare." I almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. A friend? Theodore and I had been best friends to each other for 22 years. We were each other's whole world, letting other relationships fade while we focused on our life, his business, his home. I was Theodore's wife, Stephen and Edward's stepmother, the mistress of a large house. But I had never fully understood who I was, Daphne, as a woman outside all those roles. "I don't need 48 hours, I said firmly, standing up. "I've made my decision. Prepare the papers." Michael studied my face for a long moment, searching for signs of madness or weakness. Then he slowly nodded. "All right, I'll prepare the documents. But I want everything spelled out down to the smallest detail. Their written obligation to cover the medical debts, clear and strict deadlines for you to receive the insurance payout, and a clause protecting you from any future claims related to Theodore's estate, so they can't come back to you a year from now asking for anything else. Thank you, Michael. You're a true friend. Don't thank me yet. I'm about to help you make what may be the biggest mistake of your life." As I left his office and walked across the echoing marble lobby toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished wall. The woman looking back at me was almost a stranger. Older, with shadows under her eyes, yes, but also more composed, more real than before. For the first time since my husband's death, I was forced to understand who Daphne was without all those family supports. The elevator doors opened silently, and I stepped inside. As the car glided down to the parking level, I touched the key in my purse again, through the thin leather. It was there. Theodore had left me something. I was certain of it. And whatever it was, Stephen and Edward didn't know about it. It was my secret. The key fit a safe deposit box at the main branch of First Capital Bank on Washington Street. I hadn't even known that box existed until the day before. For 2 days, I searched every inch of our huge house like a bloodhound, each empty drawer adding to my frustration and panic. And only when I went through Theodore's old leather wallet, returned to me by the hospital in a plastic bag along with his watch and wedding ring, did I find a small, unremarkable business card tucked behind his driver's license. First Capital Bank. And on the back, a number written in his bold, confident handwriting, 379. The bank manager, a pleasant gray-haired woman named Margaret, who remembered Theodore from his rare visits, greeted me with professional restraint and led me to the vault with quiet sympathy. Theodore gave very clear, strict, I would say, instructions regarding this box, she said, as we descended the marble steps into the cool underground vault. Only he and you had access, with a passport. No proxies, no lawyers. He opened it personally about 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Right around the time Theodore's health had begun to decline sharply, and when he started holding those mysterious closed-door business meetings, he never really explained to me, brushing them off as boring details. We entered the vault. The walls were lined with rows of metal boxes, each holding someone's secrets. Box 379 was larger and heavier than I expected. Margaret left me alone in a small viewing room, gently closing the heavy door behind her. In the silence, broken only by the hum of ventilation, I slid the key into the lock with trembling fingers. A turn, a click. I lifted the metal lid. Inside were documents, lots of documents, neat stacks of papers bound with rubber bands. But they weren't the dull legal files I'd expected, not old wills or insurance policies. These were personal letters, printed emails, detailed financial reports, and what looked like a professional private investigator's dossier. The first thing that caught my eye was a white envelope. On it, in Theodore's painfully familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Daphne. Open only after reading everything else." I set it aside, feeling a lump rise in my throat, and picked up the next document, a printout of an email exchange between Stephen and someone named Marcus Brennan, sent 8 months ago. And as I read the first lines, my blood ran cold and my heart skipped beats. Marcus, father is getting worse. The doctors give him 6 months at most. The outlook isn't good. We need to accelerate the asset transfer protocols. Can you speed up the paperwork for moving the funds we discussed? I need everything ready by the time... The reply was no less chilling in its cynicism. Stephen, I've prepared the documents as requested. The scheme works. Once father signs the powers of attorney without really looking, the business assets will be restructured through the shell companies we set up. Personal property can be transferred immediately after death, while the widow is in mourning. And what about the wife? Stephen asked in the next email. Daphne won't be a problem. She knows nothing about business. She's a house hen. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to change anything. Dad trusts us completely, and she trusts him. I had to read it twice before the monstrous meaning sank in. They had been planning this for months. While I was caring for Theodore, changing his sheets, taking him to doctors, monitoring every dose of medication, his own sons were coldly preparing a robbery, not just of me, but of their own dying father. The next document was a bank statement from an account I had never heard of. Vector Holding, LLC. Current balance, $14.5 million. At the bottom, a note handwritten by Theodore in blue ink. Daphne, this is our real savings. The boys think all my money is tied up in the house and business cash flow, but I moved the bulk of the assets here months ago. I tried to protect us from them. $14.5 million. We weren't poor, but we were never this rich. Theodore had been secretly wealthy, while Stephen and Edward were trying to rob their dying father for scraps, unaware of the real prize. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the papers as I reached for the next thick folder, marked in red. Private investigation. Confidential. I opened it and froze. Inside wasn't just paperwork. It was a documented chronicle of the collapse of the family I thought was mine. The photographs, spread out like a fan, spoke louder than any words. In grainy images clearly taken by a hidden camera, Stephen was caught entering and leaving the glittering doors of an upscale casino. In other shots, he sat at a poker table, and even on paper you could see how sweaty he was, how his hands trembled as they clutched the chips. The dates in the corner of the photos mercilessly showed that he'd been flying there regularly over the past year, sometimes disappearing for days, while lying to me on the phone about complicated court cases in San Francisco. The financial reports attached painted an even darker picture. Stephen, the model of success and respectability, was drowning in debt. He owed about $80,000 to various creditors, from legitimate banks to shady figures with criminal pasts. Most of it was credit card debt. Edward's file was no less devastating. The investigation conducted by Detective Daniel Peterson exposed the rotten core of his so-called consulting business. It was a sham, a soap bubble. In reality, Edward had set up a classic financial pyramid, promising investors outrageous returns. He had already lost nearly $1 million of other people's money, including the savings of several elderly clients who trusted him because of his honest face and his father's name. Both of Theodore's sons were sinking. They were flailing in a swamp of debt, lies, and looming legal trouble. Now it became terrifyingly clear why they were so predatorily, so desperately rushing to grab their father's inheritance. They didn't need memories. They needed cash to save themselves. But the most crushing document in the stack was a medical report dated just 3 months before Theodore's death. It wasn't signed by his attending physician, but by an independent professor of neurology, a visit I hadn't even known about. The conclusion was brief, dry, and unmistakable, like a point-blank shot. The patient shows no signs of cognitive impairment. Mental faculties are fully preserved, and the ability to make reasoned decisions is intact. No signs of dementia or external pressure detected. All this time, Stephen and Edward had been whispering to everyone, partners, friends, even me, that their father's illness had clouded his mind, that the old man was declining and no longer capable of managing his affairs. It was their insurance, their justification for taking control. But this report proved the opposite. Theodore was of sound mind and clear memory to the very end. He saw everything. He understood everything. The last document in the folder was a copy of another will, not the one Stephen had waved around so theatrically in the office, but a newer one, signed just 6 weeks before Theodore's death. I read the lines, the letters jumping before my eyes. According to this document, all property, absolutely everything, was to pass to me. The sons were assigned only modest trust funds with fixed monthly payments, with no access to the principal. In the margins, in Theodore's familiar sweeping handwriting, was a note. Original is with Peterson and Associates, not Michael's firm. Do not trust Michael. My heart was pounding in my throat, throbbing in my temples, as the picture came together into one terrifying puzzle. There were 2 wills. Somehow, Stephen and Edward had gotten access to the older version, or possibly pressured Michael Matthews, and were now using it to seize everything, while the real, final will was safely stored at another law firm. But why hadn't Peterson and Associates contacted me yet? Why was I only learning this now, sitting in an underground bank vault? With trembling hands, I reached for the letter from Theodore I had set aside. The white envelope felt heavy, as if filled with lead. I carefully opened it. "My dearest, beloved Daphne," it began, and I could almost hear his voice, calm and gentle. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and the boys have shown their true faces. Forgive me, my love, for not being able to tell you all this while I was alive, looking you in the eye, but I needed to be absolutely certain of their intentions. I hoped I was wrong, but facts are stubborn things." He went on to explain how his first suspicions arose when Stephen and Edward suddenly began showing excessive, intrusive attention during his illness, not out of love, not from a desire to spend time with their father, but because they were positioning themselves for a hostile takeover of his estate. He hired a detective, moved money into secret accounts, and devised this incredibly complex, multi-step plan to protect me. The boys are convinced they'll get the houses and the business, and they're already dividing what they believe is theirs. I didn't dissuade them. Peterson will explain all the legal details and consequences of my decision to you. He knows exactly what steps I took and why. Believe me, Daphne, they will not get what they expect." I stared at the lines, unable to believe my eyes, reading them over and over. Theodore had essentially handed Stephen and Edward a poisoned gift wrapped in beautiful paper. He let them think they'd won, so the trap could snap shut. "The insurance policy they spoke about with such contempt is real," the letter continued. "But it's not for $65,000 as they think. That's the old policy. The new one is for $1.6 million. And there's another, additional one for $1 million that Stephen and Edward don't know about at all. In total, $2.6 million, your safety net. Michael Matthews should never have handled my estate. He's grown too weak and too dependent on Stephen. I dismissed his firm 2 months ago but didn't inform him officially, so as not to scare the boys off. They must have convinced him to represent the family after my death, taking advantage of his ignorance. The last paragraph made tears burst from my eyes. They dripped straight onto the paper, blurring the ink of his signature. I know this may seem cruel toward my children, but I couldn't stand by and let them rob you the way they've robbed everyone else. They made their choice, Daphne. They chose money over conscience. Now they'll have to live with the consequences of that choice. You deserve better than the fate of a poor dependent they had planned for you. Take the money, call Peterson, start a new life, and don't look back. With love, forever yours, Theodore. Attached to the letter was a simple black business card for Peterson and Associates, with a handwritten note, "Contact immediately after opening the box." I sat in that small, windowless room, staring at the papers spread out before me as if they were someone else's map, too complex, too unfamiliar. I understood the main thing. Stephen and Edward had been lying to me from the very beginning, coldly, in advance, calculating every step. There was no doubt about that anymore. I also understood that Theodore hadn't abandoned me. He knew. He saw what was happening and tried to protect me in the only way he knew how, through numbers, documents, and complex legal structures I had always struggled to understand. But how exactly this plan worked, what had already taken effect, and what could still turn against me, I didn't know. These papers could be a weapon, or they could become a trap if I made the wrong move. One thing was clear: I couldn't act on emotion. If Theodore had truly left me protection, I had no right to destroy it with my own haste. I took a deep breath, wiped my tears, and carefully placed all the documents, photos, reports, statements, back into the metal box. Everything except Peterson's card and Theodore's letter. Those I slipped securely into the inner pocket of my bag, close to my body. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I would call the mysterious Daniel Peterson and learn every detail of Theodore's plan. But tonight, I had to play the most difficult role of my life. I had to endure dinner with Stephen and Edward, knowing the ugly, filthy truth about them. I would have to smile, nod, and play the part of the obedient, confused widow while they divided the skin of a bear not yet killed, discussing their grand plans for our property. I would have to pretend I didn't know that what they were about to inherit was bankruptcy, disgrace, and lawsuits. I stepped out of the bank into the noisy evening. The city was living its life, people rushing, laughing, arguing, while I felt like an alien carrying a nuclear charge inside. When I got into the car and started the engine, my phone rang. The name Edward lit up the screen. I waited a couple of seconds, gathering myself, then answered. "Daphne." His voice was warm, velvety with fake friendliness that now made me feel sick. "Jennifer and I would really love to have you over for dinner tonight. We thought it would be nice to spend some time as a family, just us, before we wrap up all those boring legal matters tomorrow." As a family. How touching. How cynical. "That sounds lovely, Edward," I replied, surprised by how calm and steady my voice sounded. "What time should I come?"
7 o'clock. And Daphne, we truly want you to know,
Stephen and I really appreciate how wisely and gracefully you're handling all this. No hysteria. Dad would be proud. Dad would be proud. If Edward only knew what Dad actually thought of his debt-ridden sons, bullies, and frauds, he would have choked on those words. "I'll be there," I said shortly. I hung up and slowly merged into traffic, heading toward what would likely be my last dinner as a powerless member of the Whitaker family, Theodore's family. The grief and confusion I'd been carrying since my husband's death hadn't gone anywhere, but now something else was mixed in with them. Something hard, cold, and focused, like the edge of a blade. Stephen and Edward thought of themselves as grandmasters, manipulating a foolish, grieving widow, pushing me into quick decisions before I could come to my senses. They didn't know one thing. Their father had outplayed them before they ever made their first move. And they certainly didn't suspect that now I, Daphne, was about to enter the game as well. Dinner promised to be very interesting. "Daphne," Stephen said, leaning forward across the table with an expression he clearly believed looked fatherly, caring, and wise. "I truly hope you haven't started doubting our agreements from yesterday because of someone's careless words. You know, people far from business and inheritance law, neighbors, friends, can give completely absurd advice that only complicates things and damages family relationships." I looked at him over my wine glass. There was a hidden threat in his voice, wrapped in velvet. He was afraid I'd spoken to someone. "Oh no, Stephen," I reassured him in the most innocent, slightly naive tone. "I'm not doubting anything. I'm just trying to be attentive, like a good hostess, the way Theodore taught me. He always said, 'Daphne, the devil is in the details.'" Edward let out a nervous laugh, spilling a drop of wine onto the tablecloth. Dad really did love his paperwork and bureaucracy. It was in his blood. "Oh, absolutely," I agreed, feeling adrenaline surge through my veins. By the way, while going through his office this afternoon, I kept finding documents I don't quite understand. Some strange bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of. Business papers from companies I didn't even know Theodore was involved with. The blood drained instantly from Edward's puffy face, turning him waxy pale. The fork froze halfway to his mouth. "What kind of documents?" he rasped. "Oh, probably nothing important. Old archives." I waved it off casually. "Just complicated financial reports, numbers, tables. Though I did find something else interesting. A key. A small one, for a safe deposit box. I'd never seen it before." Stephen went still, like a predator catching the scent of a larger beast. His eyes narrowed. "A safe deposit box key? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Isn't that strange?" I took a sip of water, enjoying the effect. I thought I knew everything about Theodore's finances. We never hid anything from each other. But apparently he had accounts and boxes I didn't know about. I suppose I should go to the bank tomorrow, check everything out, before we sign the final papers with the notary. You can't sign documents blindly, right? The look the brothers exchanged this time was pure, undiluted panic. The look of men standing at the edge of a cliff. They quickly pulled themselves together, slipping their usual masks of indifference back on, but I had seen it, that animal fear. I'd hit the mark. "Mom," Stephen said, his voice tense despite his effort to sound relaxed. "You really shouldn't burden yourself with all that paperwork during such a difficult time. Legal documents can be very confusing for someone without a business background. You might misinterpret the numbers. Why don't you let Edward and me look through everything you found? We'll handle it." "That's very kind of you, boys," I replied softly but firmly. "But I think Theodore would want me to understand our financial situation myself. After all, I'll have to manage on my own now, without his guidance. I need to learn independence." Sensing that the tension at the table had reached a breaking point, Jennifer came back from the kitchen, carrying a huge cake on a tray. Her smile looked like it had been taped onto her face. "And here's dessert," she announced a little too loudly. "Chocolate truffle. Edward loves it." As she served the cake onto plates, The conversation was forcibly steered towards safer topics: the unusual heat in the city, Edward's latest consulting project, which I now knew was a financial pyramid, and the successes of Stephen's law firm, built on credit card debt. But I could physically feel the tension vibrating beneath their polite small talk, like a high-voltage current. They ate, drank, laughed, but their thoughts were somewhere else, in that safe deposit box whose contents they could only guess at. After dinner, when I was already standing in the hallway putting on my coat, Stephen offered to walk me to my car. The evening air was cool. Dogs were barking somewhere in the distance. "Daphne," he said, placing his hand on my car door and stopping me from closing it. His face, lit by a street lamp, looked predatory. "About those documents you mentioned at the table." "Yes, Stephen. I think it would be best if you brought them to our next meeting. Don't go to the bank alone. Why burden yourself? Let Edward and me help you separate what's important from what's just clutter. Father's filing system in recent years, well, let's just say it wasn't always logical. He could have kept all kinds of junk." I smiled at him with the same pleasant, empty smile I'd worn all evening, like armor. "Of course, Stephen. Family should help family. I'll definitely take your advice into account." I got behind the wheel, and only then did he remove his hand. But as I drove away from their luxurious house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Stephen didn't go back inside. He stood on the driveway, already pressing his phone to his ear. He was making a call that couldn't wait even a minute, probably to his pet lawyer or an accomplice at the bank. Panic had begun. By the time I reached my house, still my house for now, it was deep into the night. I stepped into the empty, silent hall, and just then my phone rang inside my bag. The sound was deafening in the quiet of the sleeping house. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" I sank into Theodore's chair in his office, not turning on the light. "Daphne?" The male voice on the other end was calm. "This is Daniel Peterson, managing partner at Peterson & Associates. I apologize for the late call, but this matter is urgent." My heart skipped a beat. That Peterson. "Daniel," I said, feeling my fingers tremble. "How did you get my number? And why are you calling now?" "I assume you found the documents," he replied instead of answering. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "Your husband left me very clear instructions, a kind of beacon. If you used the key and opened box 379, the bank employee was to notify me within 2 hours. The system worked. Daphne, we need to meet, as soon as possible, preferably tomorrow morning." "Is this about the inheritance?" "It's about everything, Daphne. There are things you must know before you sign a single paper with Stephen and Edward. They're rushing you for a reason." "I know," I said quietly. "I saw the emails. I saw the debts." "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg," Peterson replied. "What's in my safe changes everything. Absolutely everything. You're not the victim in this story, Daphne. Theodore made sure you would be the judge." We agreed to meet at 9 in the morning. After hanging up, I looked around the room. The shadows in the office no longer felt threatening. They felt like allies. The invisible game I'd played all evening, bluffing with card sharps at the same table, was about to turn into open war. I was driving to Daniel Peterson not for comfort and not for confirmation of my suspicions. I was going for clarity. If Theodore had truly built protection for me, I needed to understand it fully, before Stephen and Edward forced me to sign even one document. Daniel Peterson's office was a sharp contrast to the polished chrome and glass luxury of Michael Matthews's suites in the financial district. Located in an old brick mansion on a quiet street, it radiated solidity. This was a place where real, dirty work was done, not where rich clients were dazzled. Heavy oak doors, the smell of old paper and coffee, shelves of law books from floor to ceiling. Peterson himself was a surprise, too. I'd expected another shark in an expensive suit, but instead, I was greeted by a soft-spoken man in his early 60s, wearing a tweed jacket and horn-rimmed glasses. He had kind, intelligent eyes and the hands of someone used to working, not just signing invoices. "Daphne," he said, rising from behind a desk covered in organized chaos, folders and documents everywhere. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit down. Tea, coffee? We have a long conversation ahead of us." I sat in the worn leather chair across from him, clutching my bag with Theodore's letter like a shield. "Daniel, I'll be honest. I'm completely confused. I lived with my husband for many years and didn't even know he had another lawyer. We always worked with Michael." "He hired me about 8 months ago," Peterson replied, pulling a thick, bulging folder from the safe. "At first, it was just for a discreet, unofficial investigation into some financial irregularities he noticed in the company reports. He didn't want to make noise. He didn't want to believe his own sons were involved. But as we uncovered more and more facts, my role expanded significantly. Theodore realized that Michael was either incompetent or, more likely, playing on your stepson's side. He opened the folder, and I saw copies of many documents I'd already seen in the bank vault, along with others that were new to me: charts, tables, transcripts. "Your husband was a very intelligent and forward-thinking man, Daphne. When he fully understood what his sons were planning, not just to wait for the inheritance, but to accelerate the process and leave you with nothing, he developed a comprehensive strategy. He called this project Retribution." "The investigation showed they were stealing from him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Peterson nodded grimly, flipping through the pages. "And the scale will shock you. Stephen forged his father's signature on loan agreements and guarantees, using the family business as collateral to cover his gambling debts. He's a gambling addict, Daphne, and a severe one. With Edward, it's even worse. He's cynical to the core. He systematically siphoned funds from VIP clients' accounts into shell companies, patching the holes with his father's money. Both of them are facing real prison time under multiple charges: fraud, embezzlement, forgery. If Theodore had filed a report while he was alive, they'd already be behind bars." A chill ran down my spine. Criminal cases, prison. My stepsons were criminals. Your husband could have turned them in. That would have been lawful. But he loved them, despite everything. Or perhaps he pitied them. Instead of arrest, he chose a more creative, I'd say, educational form of justice. Peterson took out another set of documents, tied with a red ribbon, and spread them across the desk. "These are the property records, your house and the villa. Look at the dates. As of 6 months ago, both properties were mortgaged to the maximum of their market value. Your husband took out loans secured by the real estate." "But why?" I breathed, my head spinning. "We had no debts. We were well off. Why would he take out loans?" "Because he knew Stephen and Edward would latch onto the real estate with a death grip. It's the only thing they truly care about, and he wanted to make sure that along with elite square footage, they would inherit elite debt." Peterson paused, letting it sink in. "The money from those loans, and it's a huge amount, is safely parked in protected offshore trust accounts under Vector Holding, to which only you have access. Theodore monetized the inheritance. He turned walls into cash and handed it to you, leaving his sons only beautiful facades loaded with debt." The room tilted. I imagined Stephen's face when he learned the truth. "So when they accept the inheritance, they receive assets that are effectively worthless? The house is valued at $2.8 million, but the debt is $4 million. The villa is $2.5 million, with $2.6 million in debt. By accepting the inheritance, they automatically assume the loan obligations, and if they can't pay, they won't, given their personal bankruptcies," Peterson finished calmly. "The bank will take everything." "They showed me a will," I whispered. "There was nothing in it about debts." "They showed you an outdated copy," Peterson said gently. "That will was canceled by the final version, signed by your husband 6 weeks before his death in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. Here it is." He handed me a document on official letterhead. "The real will leaves everything: Money, accounts, rights, to you. But there's one nuance, a devilish detail. It states that the real estate may be transferred to the sons, Stephen and Edward, only by the personal, voluntary decision of my wife, Daphne. The choice is entirely yours. You can keep the houses and pay off the debts from the trust, or you can gift them to the boys. I scanned the text, relying on her wisdom and judgment in determining what they truly deserve. Theodore left the launch button with me, I said quietly. Exactly. He gave you the right to pull the trigger, or to grant mercy. At that moment, my phone rang. Stephen's name flashed on the screen. Don't answer, Peterson advised when he saw me reach for it. Not yet. Let them sweat. We still need to discuss the insurance policies. But the phone kept ringing, insistent, demanding. Then messages started coming in. Pick up immediately. Another one. Mom, this is a disaster. There was panic in that urgency. Real, animal panic. Finally, I answered and put the call on speaker. Daphne! Stephen's voice cracked into a shrill edge. He was gasping as if he'd run a marathon. Where are you? We need to talk. Now. Something unexpected has happened. What happened, Stephen? I asked calmly. Someone from Peterson and Associates called Edward this morning, 5 minutes ago. They claim they have documents invalidating the will we're working with. They say they represent Dad. Daphne, they're frauds. We think someone is trying to steal our inheritance. I looked at Daniel. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. A cold, satisfied smile of a chess player delivering checkmate. Stephen, I don't understand, I said into the phone. What documents? What are you talking about? Legal papers that make no sense. Some new trust, some accounts. Listen, Mom, I think you need to come to Michael's office immediately. Do you hear me? Immediately. We're all gathering there. We need to develop a defense strategy before these scammers freeze the assets. I'll be there in an hour, I said, and hung up without waiting for a reply. Peterson looked at me. Well then, Daphne, the moment of truth has arrived. The pieces are on the board. What do you want to do? I looked at the documents spread across the table, proof of betrayal, theft, and cruelty. I remembered Edward yesterday, wiping his mouth with a napkin while lecturing about family values, knowing he planned to throw me out on the street. I remembered Stephen, who thought I was a foolish old woman good for nothing but signing away my rights. I want them to get exactly what they fought for, I said slowly. They wanted the real estate? They'll get it, along with all the mortgages. Are you sure? Peterson asked. There's no going back. This will destroy them. Daniel, I said, standing up and smoothing the folds of my skirt. I think it's time Stephen and Edward learned what happens when you underestimate your father and his wife. Let's go to Michael. I want to see their faces. As the taxi carried me toward Michael Matthews' office, my phone lay vibrating nonstop on my lap, like a wounded animal in convulsions. The stream of messages turned into a full-blown avalanche of hysteria. Stephen. Mom, please, don't talk to those people without me. Don't sign anything. Edward. Daphne, there are professional scammers involved. They're taking advantage of your condition. Be careful. We'll protect you. Jennifer. We're all family. Don't let outsiders come between us. I can't sit still. Family. They still thought that word was a magic key, capable of opening any door and making me forget reality. But as shop windows flashed past outside the cab, I realized with terrifying clarity the woman who had cried into her pillow just yesterday had died. For the first time in 22 years, I was heading forward not as Theodore's wife, not as the shadow of a great man, and not as a convenient, obedient stepmother forever seeking the approval of his grown sons. I was going as Daphne Whitaker, the sole owner of an $18 million fortune, the holder of full evidence of my stepson's criminal acts, and, in essence, the judge of their fate. The frightened, grieving widow they had so roughly pushed around at the memorial no longer existed. In her place, in the back seat of the taxi, sat another woman, dangerous, cold, and calculating. a woman with nothing left to lose, but with the power to take everything. The conference room at Matthews and Associates greeted me with stale air and the smell of fear. Never before had this spacious room with its panoramic windows felt so claustrophobic. Stephen and Edward sat on one side of the long mahogany table. Their jackets were draped over chairbacks, their ties loosened, and their pale, sweaty faces revealed the depth of their nervous exhaustion. Michael sat in his usual seat at the head of the table, but he looked pitiful. He fidgeted, shuffled papers, and avoided meeting my eyes. Daniel followed me in calmly, placed his bulky, worn briefcase at my feet, and sat down beside me. He radiated the icy composure of a man who didn't just have an ace up his sleeve, but the entire deck. "Daphne!" Stephen exclaimed, jumping to his feet the moment I crossed the threshold. "Thank God you're here. We're losing our minds. This whole situation has become completely absurd. We urgently need to clear up some monstrous misunderstandings." "What misunderstandings exactly are you referring to, Stephen?" I asked, slowly and with dignity, taking my seat and folding my hands on the tabletop. My voice was quiet, but in the silence of the room, it rang out like a struck gong. Edward immediately jumped in, his voice trembling with fake alarm and outrage. "Someone is spreading false, slanderous information about Dad's estate. Some insane claims about other wills, hidden accounts nobody ever knew about. Things that make absolutely no sense. We're very concerned that dishonest people," he shot a venomous glance at Peterson, "are trying to exploit your grief and deceive all of us." Michael cleared his throat, clearly feeling the ground burn beneath his feet. "Daphne, I must admit, I'm completely confused myself. Mr. He checked a business card. "Peterson claims to have documents that invalidate the will we've been working with all this time. But Theodore never, and I emphasize never, mentioned changing lawyers or drafting new documents. This is nonsense." "It's not nonsense, Michael. It's because Theodore no longer trusted you," I said, looking straight at the bridge of his nose. A dead silence fell over the room. The hum of the air conditioner was suddenly audible. Red blotches spread across Michael's face, and Stephen and Edward exchanged looks of raw animal terror. "Excuse me," the lawyer muttered, loosening his tie. "I handled your family's affairs for 15 years. I opened my handbag and, slowly and deliberately, took out Theodore's letter, the one I found in the safe deposit box. Theodore discovered that someone from your firm had been regularly leaking confidential information about his plans and his health to Stephen and Edward. He couldn't be 100% sure whether it was you personally, behind his back, or one of your employees, so he decided to move all his affairs elsewhere and keep it strictly confidential. To protect me." "That's impossible," Stephen blurted out too quickly. "Dad trusted Michael completely. They were friends." "Really?" I turned my gaze to my stepson, savoring the way his confident lawyer mask began to crack. "Then tell me, Stephen, why did he secretly hire a private detective to investigate your financial activities and your trips to casinos? And why did he transfer $14.5 million into trust accounts that only I can access?" Edward made a strangled sound, like a hiccup, and grabbed his glass of water. The water spilled across the polished table. $14.5 million? That's nonsense. Dad didn't have that kind of liquid money. Everything was tied up in operations. "Actually, he did," Daniel interjected. His voice was calm and clinical, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. He opened his briefcase and began laying documents on the table. "Your father was far wealthier than either of you could have imagined in your wildest fantasies. For years, he had been building a protected portfolio specifically to ensure Daphne's safety after his death." Peterson slid a stack of papers toward the brothers, bank statements, stamped investment reports, ownership certificates. "And now to what interests you most. Real estate. The house in Boston that you believe you've already divided. There's a fresh mortgage on it for $4 million. The villa in Aspen carries a burden of $2.6 million. Your father took out these loans deliberately so that any inheritance of real estate would come packaged with a debt pit. The loan proceeds were withdrawn and are now in Daphne's possession. Stephen's face shifted from pale to an ashen gray. He grabbed the papers, his hands shaking so badly the sheets rustled. "You're lying. This is forged." "I'm afraid not," Peterson continued evenly. "Everything is properly registered. But that's not all. Your father documented every one of your moves, including your credit card debts, Stephen, to various creditors, some of whom are very impatient, and Edward's fraudulent schemes, which cost his clients nearly $1 million and fall squarely under criminal fraud statutes." "This is blackmail!" Edward's voice jumped into a falsetto as he sprang from his chair. "This is harassment. You won't be able to prove anything." Peterson smiled faintly, like a shark before striking, and pulled out another folder. Black. "Actually, I can, and quite easily. Here are bank records confirming the forgery of your father's signatures on loan agreements. Here are records of client funds being transferred into your personal offshore accounts, Edward. And here are transcripts of your phone conversations, where the two of you discuss how you'll deceive your father and throw your stepmother out of the house while Theodore was dying in intensive care." The temperature in the room seemed to drop to absolute zero. Michael stared at the documents in horror, the horror of a man realizing he'd been used in the dark and made a fool of, his life's reputation destroyed. "Daphne," Stephen croaked, collapsing back into his chair. For the first time, his voice carried real despair. "You don't believe these papers, do you? We're family. We love you. We just wanted what was best." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word. It was bitter. "You loved me so much, Stephen, when you said that after all these years I'd get $65,000 and a kick out the door. You loved me when you gave me 30 days to get out of my own home, knowing I had nowhere to go." Jennifer, who had been sitting curled up in the corner, suddenly spoke. "This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. Daphne, dear, we can fix everything. We can renegotiate. We'll give up part of our share." "Actually," I interrupted her, "there's nothing to renegotiate. The real will, the only one with legal force, leaves everything to me. The decision of whether Stephen and Edward receive even a single cent or a single brick from this house depends entirely, 100%, on me." I reached into my bag again and took out the final document. "This is the deed of gift I prepared this morning with Daniel. I'm giving you exactly what you tried so desperately to take from me." Stephen snatched the paper from my hands and began reading frantically. His face shifted at lightning speed, confusion, realization, disbelief, and finally pure terror. You're giving us the house and the villa?" Edward said slowly, syllable by syllable, peering over his brother's shoulder. "But with the mortgages—" "That's right," I nodded. "You'll become the proud owners of elite real estate with a total market value of about $5.3 million, but with debt of $6.6 million. That leaves you $1.3 million in the red, owing the bank. The first payment, $50,000, is due in 3 days." "You can't do this!" Stephen shouted, slamming the document onto the table. "This is madness. Why would we want assets with negative value?" "I can, and I am. This is exactly what Theodore wanted. He wanted you to get what you were so eager for, status and property, and to face the consequences of your greed at the same time." Michael finally found his voice, though it was trembling. "Daphne, this is an extremely unconventional move. It's a trap. Maybe we should pause, cool down, and look at all possible compromises." "No," I cut him off firmly, standing up. "I've considered everything. The pauses are over. The offer stands here and now. Stephen and Edward can accept the inheritance as it is, houses with debt, or they can walk out of here with nothing. Absolutely nothing. There will be no other options." "And if we refuse to sign?" Edward asked, staring at the floor like a scolded schoolboy. Daniel Peterson answered, snapping his briefcase shut with a loud click. Then Daphne leaves this office and goes straight to the prosecutor's office to initiate criminal proceedings. Abuse of trust, large-scale fraud, document forgery, intentional bankruptcy. The evidence file is already complete. You're both facing real prison time. The choice is yours: debt slavery or a prison cell. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the moment before a storm. I watched Stephen's mind race, desperately searching for a loophole, a legal hook, a way to twist out, bargain, or deceive. But the trap had slammed shut for good. Edward looked completely crushed. He was silently crying. At last, Stephen raised his eyes to me. The arrogance was gone. Only fear and hatred remained, the look of a cornered animal. "What do you want from us?" he hissed. "I want you to sign the papers and accept the inheritance on my terms," I said, enunciating every word. "I want you to sign a full waiver of any future claims. I want you to agree never, do you hear me? Never, to contact me again, come near me, or call me. And I want you to understand this was your father's choice, not out of hatred, but because your greed left him no other option." Jennifer began sobbing loudly, smearing mascara down her cheeks. "This will ruin us. We'll lose everything. We have children." "You should have thought about that before you started stealing from your children's dying grandfather," I said, without a trace of sympathy. My heart was locked shut. Edward lifted his head and looked at me with something strange in his eyes, a mix of fear and unwilling respect. He really planned all this? Every detail? The mortgages? The detective? "Your father was far smarter than you ever gave him credit for, Edward. You thought he was a senile old man. He was a grandmaster." In the end, they signed. Pens scratched in the silence. They had no choice. The alternative was prison and disgrace. And even in their desperation, they weren't ready to trade Italian suits for prison uniforms. As they left the conference room, slumped, broken, Stephen paused at the door. He turned back, his face gray as ash. "This isn't over, Daphne. We'll challenge this." "No, Stephen," I replied calmly, meeting his eyes. "This is exactly the end. Absolute and final. You have 3 days to find the money for the bank. If I were you, I'd hurry instead of wasting time on empty threats." The door closed. I stood in the middle of the vast office, feeling the tremor finally leave my knees. I had done it. I had won. When the heavy oak door shut behind my stepsons, cutting off their hysterical sobbing, a ringing, overwhelming silence filled the room. Even the air seemed cleaner, like after a storm when ozone replaces suffocation. I slowly exhaled, feeling the iron band of tension that had been squeezing my chest for weeks begin to loosen, giving way to deep, leaden exhaustion. Michael, still sitting at the head of the table like a defeated general of a lost army, looked as if he had aged 10 years in the past hour. His immaculate suit hung loosely on him, and his face had taken on an earthy gray tone. With a trembling hand, he removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with the eyes of a beaten dog seeking forgiveness. "Daphne," he began, his voice betraying him. "I swear on my grandchildren's health I had no idea about the double game. If I had suspected for even a second that someone from my firm, someone I trusted like myself, was leaking confidential information to Stephen, I would have—" "It doesn't matter anymore, Michael," I interrupted gently but decisively. "Theodore knew, and he took action. That's enough. The story is over." The lawyer opened his mouth to object, but I raised my hand, stopping the flow of unnecessary words. "Please prepare the final property transfer documents according to what was signed today and submit everything to the land registry by the end of the day. This will be the last thing your firm does for the Whitaker family. After that, all my affairs, including trust management, will be handled by Daniel." Daniel nodded briefly, accepting the baton, and calmly began gathering the documents into his briefcase. Michael could only open and close his mouth soundlessly, like a fish thrown onto shore. He understood perfectly well that he had just lost the biggest client of his career and destroyed his firm's reputation through his own blindness and desire to please the young heirs. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze, but not the haze of confusion. It was the haze of focused, methodical action. I returned to that very house, the house Stephen and Edward had so generously allowed me to occupy for 30 days, and began packing. But now I did it not as an exile being pushed out the door, but as someone in control, voluntarily closing a chapter of a book that was no longer interesting. Strangely, I felt neither grief nor nostalgia as I packed crystal, books, and photographs. The walls of the vast mansion, which should have held the warmth of my life with Theodore, now looked like just walls, drywall, expensive Venetian plaster, paint. The soul of the house had left with Theodore. What remained was simply expensive real estate with massive mortgage debt, now hanging like a stone around his sons' necks. I took only what truly mattered to my heart, things you can't buy with money, our old, worn photo albums, Theodore's favorite books with his notes in the margins, his collection of rare jazz records, and a few paintings we'd bought together at flea markets for almost nothing, back when we were young and carefree. Daniel helped me at every step, becoming my guardian angel. He was the one who found a realtor in California who sent me a detailed video tour of a small, cozy cottage. The moment I saw the terrace wrapped in wild grapevines, the old cypress trees, and the blue strip of ocean on the horizon, I knew this was it. A place where no one would know me as the widow of the magnate Theodore or the stepmother of those notorious fraudsters. A place where I could breathe. On the day of my departure, I walked through the empty rooms of the house one last time. My footsteps echoed. In Theodore's office, I paused by the window, looking out at the garden already preparing for autumn. "Goodbye," I said softly to the emptiness. "And thank you for all the good that was here. I'm leaving the bad behind." I placed the key ring on the kitchen table. Next to it, unable to resist a touch of dark irony, I left a copy of the mortgage payment schedule the bank had kindly sent to the new owners. The first payment, $50,000, was due in 3 days. I knew for certain Stephen and Edward didn't have that money. The flight and the move took 2 days. My new home stood on a quiet hillside, far from the noisy tourist promenade. It was peaceful and calm there. I spent my first evening in the new place on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket with a glass of wine, listening to the sound of the waves. For the first time in many months, maybe even years, I wasn't waiting for a catch. I didn't need to look over my shoulder, didn't need to weigh every word, fearing my stepson's reactions, didn't need to defend myself. I was completely, almost frighteningly free. I was no longer just Theodore's widow or someone's stepmother. I had become Daphne, a woman who writes the script of her own life with her own hands. And in this new script, there was no longer any place for victims, only fighters and winners. And now, dear friends, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, your opinions, as those who walked this long and difficult path with me all the way to the end. What would you have done in my place, faced with such a hard moral choice? Would you have felt sorry for stepsons who betrayed and humiliated you and given them part of the inheritance for the sake of your husband's memory? Or would you have acted just as firmly and decisively as I did, letting them reap the consequences of their own greed? Perhaps some of you have experienced something similar in your own lives, facing blatant injustice from loved ones, fights over property, and betrayal by those you trusted the most. Please don't hesitate. Share your thoughts and personal stories in the comments below. Your experience, your voice, might help someone else make the right, life-saving decision at a difficult moment. And while you're writing, I'll leave 2 other stories on the screen that our viewers have really loved, and I'm sure they'll surprise and move you just as much as this one. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more real-life stories ahead.